Hello and welcome to the first ever TSR Answers. We have brought together an expert panel to ask all of your GCSE and A-level grading questions following the cancellation of this summer's exam series. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a second and we'll dive straight into the questions. We've had so many. But first I wanted to explain briefly what TSR Answers is, why we're doing it and what you can expect from us in the future. In March, the entire world changed, and so did it all our lives did as well. The COVID pandemic meant there'd been a dramatic change in all our plans and routines, and that was certainly true for young people and students. At the student room, we've always tried to bring our best to support young people in whatever's going on in their lives. So we had to take stock and reassess and work out how best we could help. We asked our users what factors were most affecting them and what issues were most pressing at the end of May, and 6 factors really stood out, and they were a lack of purpose or routine, uncertainty around education, uncertainty around future career prospects, loneliness, concerns about myself or my loved ones getting ill, and a lack of entertainment. We decided to pull these into 4 main groups, and we've named them Your Education, Your Future, Your Wellbeing and Your Life. So each week TSR Answers aims to bring a new panel in front of you, answering questions, offering support and bringing a direct, clear voice amongst all the noise to help students make the right decision for themselves and to help you look after yourself and help you thrive. This week is our first panel and it's on your education. And just a brief note that next week on Thursday we'll take a deeper dive on what the COVID-19 impact is on students aiming to start university this year in the first Your Future series. So make sure you come back and check that out. We've already had over 100 questions asked before this started today. And although we won't be able to answer every single one in the hour that we have, we will try our best to answer the common themes that have cropped up and try and get through as many as possible. TSR separately we'll look to try and answer some of the questions that we haven't got around to if we can. But I think it's probably best if I let the panelists introduce themselves briefly rather than me nattering on, and then maybe we'll have a brief overview of where we are and then we'll jump straight into the questions. So could we start with you, Richard, maybe just a brief introduction?
Yeah, good afternoon, Joe, and thanks very much for having us. It's a really good opportunity to try and sort of talk directly to students about this. So it's really important that we do that. So my name is Richard Garrett. I'm Director of Policy and Strategic Relations at the exam board regulator, Ofqual. So we're the organisation that oversee the organisations that offer GCSEs, A-levels and vocational qualifications in England.
Thank you very much. Derek, is that okay if you go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe, and hi everybody that's joining today. My name's Derek Richardson. I'm the responsible officer at Pearson, and we're the organisation that delivers all of the qualifications that you might take under the ASCL or BTEC badges. So that's all your A-levels, GCSEs and BTEC qualifications. And my role at Pearson is to be responsible for all of the grades that are awarded. And if you get your certificates from us at the end of the summer, then you will see my name at the bottom of it and my signature. So I look forward to that and look forward to issuing those for you this year.
Thank you so much. And Duncan, would it be okay if you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone. My name's Duncan Baldwin. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at the Association of School and College Leaders. And we represent senior leaders in schools and colleges, that's heads, deputies, that sort of person, and also head teachers in the role that's relevant here are the heads of exam centres. So I've been sort of leading and on this piece of work for our association and doing the best I can to try and help all of the members up and down the country, trying to support them in the process of doing the centre assessed grades that you're all so interested in.
Thank you so much. Before we jump into the questions that have been coming through, obviously people that are watching this will have different levels of knowledge about what exactly is going on. I wondered, Richard, if you didn't mind, just to kind of give a vague overview, really briefly, just sum it up in a minute or two, of kind of where we are with the GCSE A-level grading and what's happened up to this point. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. So I'll focus on GCSEs and level if that's what you want, Joe. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that clearly there are going to be no exams this year, and that's due to the exceptional situation that's been created by the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a decision that was taken by the government, and I think the first thing to say about that is that is to express sympathy with all the students who are going to be denied the chance to take their exams this year. And I know that for some people that might be welcome, but we've been sort of pretty overwhelmed by the number of people who contacted us, setting out their disappointment, setting out their concerns about this. And what we want to do today is talk about the arrangements we're putting in place to make sure that the grades that are awarded this year are as fair as possible, given these circumstances. So I think, as I said, I think the first thing to emphasise is that it was a government decision. It was a government decision to close schools, and therefore it wouldn't be possible for exams to take place. And the government's formally asked us to do two things in particular, I think, to make sure that students this year getting their work, and that in addition, that there's an option for students who don't feel the grade reflects their performance to sit an exam at the earliest opportunity once schools are open again in the autumn. And if it's helpful, I can say a very brief bit about how this will operate, although I think we'll get into the detail of this in the questions that follow. And I know that many of you are going to have heard some of this from your schools and colleges too. So that as exams won't take place this year, your grades are going to be based on evidence of your likely performance in the summer had the exams gone ahead. So schools and colleges will submit to each exam board for each student and for each subject they were entered in a judgment about the grade that they think that each student would have been most likely to achieve, and the rank order of each student at each grade in each subject of that school or college. And these are going to be holistic judgments informed by evidence of students' performance across the whole course of study. And I think that then it's probably just important just to emphasise that once schools and colleges submit their information on students' expected performance to exam board, it was going to then be statistically standardised before results are issued. And that's because it's not going to be possible in the time available to standardise the process by which schools and colleges make their judgments before they're submitted to the exam boards. And we know that teachers are very well equipped to make these judgments, to rank order their students. But inevitably, some schools and colleges are going to be slightly more generous than others, and others slightly more severe than average when they're determining the grades. So as far as possible, that's going to be correct exam boards will standardise the grades when the results are issued this summer.
Thank you so much. I found that really helpful just as an overview, so I'm sure loads of people thought. I think we'll jump into the questions and try and get as many of these done as possible. I think you may have hinted at a couple of these things, Richard, already, but I think addressing each one individually would be useful. The first one is from user Matt LCFC, who asks, will it be acknowledged that students would have improved between March, when schools close, and May? I think if we go back to you, Richard, briefly, and then maybe go to Duncan as well on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I think the answer to Matt's question is yes. In fact, that's exactly what we're asking teachers to consider. So I think that when we're asking teachers to determine centre assessment grades, we're asking them to determine the grade they believe that a student would have obtained if they'd taken the qualification, if they'd sat the exams as normal in the summer. And so we're asking, so the question they're being asked is, what result do you think the student would have got in the summer? Not, for example, what did they get in their last mock or the last essay that they handed in. We're asking them actually to make a holistic judgment that takes account of the full range of evidence. So that's going to be all the evidence of how they would have improved across the course and the different their sort of strengths and weaknesses that they've demonstrated, but also taking into account the likely improvement that would have taken place in those final months up to taking the exam. So I think it's really important to emphasise that this is a holistic judgment about the grade that they would have received, not a kind of mechanistic one about the last result that they got.
Thank you. Duncan, would you like to add to that at all?
Perhaps give an example of the sorts of thoughts that teachers would have had. So I was talking to a school that's doing this process the other day, and I think it was they were looking at history GCSE grades, and in the sort of the first batch of results that they'd produced, they thought that the boys' grades were a bit low, but then after discussing that with the colleagues who were sort of teaching history to GCSE, they know that the improvement that boys tend to sort of improve late on. And what they did was they looked not just at the individual students in this year, but they also looked at the grade students got last year and the relationship between sort of mock results last year and the grades that they went on to get. So they could see that there was a big impact just in the run up to exams of the way that they were learning, you know, the way that they were learning that subject in that school. And that's just one example of the sort of range of evidence that teachers are looking at the moment. You know, they're taking a really good, broad, deep look at not just how the students are performing in this group, but other things that they know. And absolutely right. I think, you know, factoring in improvement would be one of those things. And just to sort of emphasize the point that Richard made about, say, mocks, I'm sure, you know, many of the students watching will be saying, oh crikey, I now wish I'd worked harder for my mocks and done something a bit better. It isn't that. You shouldn't worry about that. What the schools are using is mocks as an indication of where everybody is. They're not using that to determine the grade, if you like. It's a way to see, you know, who's performing at that level broadly if they went on to study, you know, and then take the exam. So so you shouldn't worry if you haven't done all that well in your mock. It's just one part of the evidence being considered.
Thank you so much. While on the kind of range of evidence that's being used, I want to go to our next question, which is from Peaches456. This was submitted right at the start. She says that her school won't take into account any work set after the lockdown was announced, but has a friend in a local private school that is still continuing to assess work that's being done at this point, saying they've even had online exams recently, which the school will use to assess pupils. I don't know if, Richard, you'd be able to talk about the potential fairness in this and that differing of schools and how that works.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is that we and the exam board, no requirement for schools or for colleges to set additional work, to set additional mock exams or homework tasks or anything like that for the purposes of determining a centre assessment grade. What we have decided, I think, is that schools and colleges are best placed to decide what work they set for their students, and indeed what use they make of it at this time. But we have put in place a couple of really important and clear stipulations. So the first is that no student should be disadvantaged if they're unable to complete work after schools were closed. So we know there's all sorts of reasons why people might be unable to do that. They might be ill, they might be caring for someone who's ill, the circumstances in which they're living might make it difficult for them to complete work. And so no student should be disadvantaged by whether or not they're able to complete any work that's set. The second thing that we've done is that we've issued guidance to head teachers that they need to be really careful about any work that they consider after the 20th of March if that suggests a change in the student's performance, because it might just reflect the context in which the work is done. So bluntly, it might reflect the fact that a student's finding it difficult to work in this time, or they've had additional help or assistance, because of course it's much harder for a college or a school to check on exactly what's been happening. I think that relates to the kind of the impact on individuals. But I think another the sort of focus of the question is really on whether or not that might give some schools or some students in some schools an advantage over others. And I think that it's most important to remember here that, as we talked about right at the start, that the grades that the schools and colleges submit are going to be nationally standardised. because of the point that it may be that some are a bit more generous, some are a bit harsher than others. And so if the grading judgments in some schools and colleges appear to be a bit more severe or generous than others, they will be standardised and brought up or down accordingly. And so people don't need to worry that if there's a different practice going on in another school and college, it's going to unduly affect their results.
Okay, thank you so much. I was planning on, we have a few questions about the standardization that I was planning on moving to, but I just wondered if any of our panelists had anything to add to that before we move on. Duncan?
Yeah, just to add, we need to be careful here that we're talking about what sort of work we're talking about. So Richard's, of course, absolutely right about the fact that work, following the 20th of March, not important, not relevant to the actual grading process, and the reasons why are absolutely right. But that's not to say, of course, that students shouldn't try and finish their course. That's a very useful thing to do, particularly if students are sort of planning to do that subject at A level, or go off into higher education. So we'd certainly want students to carry on studying and completing the programme of study, but absolutely, that work won't make any difference to what the centre submits for its grades, and it certainly won't impact on the grades that children will actually get.
Thank you so much.
Joe, I think I just add to that. It absolutely agree with what Richard and Duncan are saying, and to say that since the government announced the cancellation of the exams, we've been working really hard with the other exam boards as well, so that point Richard was making about consistency and fairness works across schools, but it also works across exam boards and across subjects as well. So please don't worry if you're sitting with different exam boards of different schools. The whole process is built to ensure that consistency and fairness as well.
I've already seen we're a quarter away through our time, so we'll move on to standardization. Now, we're getting a few live questions here about small cohorts in schools that are seen to be performing weakly by Ofqual, and follow-ups with about large emphasis being placed on centres' prior attainment. With those in mind, I wanted to ask you off the bat how exactly the standardization model is going to work, and if there are many students of equal, near, inseparable calibre, if they had taken exams, how is it fair that people will be placed at the top and bottom of ranks and risk having their grades altered? Richard, would you be able to touch on that for us, maybe, and talk about how the centre's prior attainment as well will
okay. That. So I think to kind of engage directly with the question, I think the standardization model is integral to fairness in this year's results, and it's part of the process by which we make sure the results are as fair as possible. So as I've said before, we know that teachers are making really difficult judgments informed by all the evidence that they can draw upon here, but that we know that, given that it's not been possible to standardise all the teachers in the country in the time available, some inevitably are going to be a bit more severe, some are inevitably going to be more lenient. The standardisation process allows us to correct for that. So all central assessment grades will be standardised through the statistical model. The statistical model will be based on the expected national outcomes for this year's students, so what we'd expect the whole cohort of students to get. It's be based on the prior attainment of students at each school, but at the level of the group of students in that school, not the individual level, and the previous results of the school knowledge. And what we're doing at the moment is that we have a set of aims for the statistical model, which are around it being as accurate and fair as it can be, and we're testing the statistical model and testing the relative weight of those different factors to make sure that it functions as effectively as it can do. And the model will help align judgments. So as I say, it will move up or move down a particular school or college's results to align the standards nationally. Just a couple of details. I think it's going to operate at subject level. So, for example, the standardisation of GCSE English language is not going to be affected by the standardisation of history. So it might be that one of the implications of that is that schools and colleges might see different levels of adjustment in different subjects. But what I would just emphasise in terms of the point about fairness is that we know that school and college-based assessment has already plays an important role in many GCSEs, A-levels and other qualifications. And in this kind of unprecedented situation, schools and colleges are best placed to judge the likely performance of their students. And actually, the research evidence tells us that we know that teachers can rank all students, put their students into rank order with a very high degree of accuracy. So I think people can be assured and have confidence that the different pieces of information that have been collected from schools and the way the standardization model is going to work will be robust and fair and lead to the fairest possible outcomes.
Thank you so much. We have another follow-up question here from Treetop321. I think you have already hinted on it as well, but I thought I'd offer it out to the whole panel about the standardization process and it being fair, but specifically that exam boards have the power and will, in certain cases, change grades, even though they haven't been able to see any of the students' work themselves. As Richard has spoken on this already, can I come to you first, Duncan, and then see if Derek would like to add anything on that as well? Would that be okay?
Yes, and the word fair is an interesting word to use under these circumstances. I think is the point, isn't it? You know, none of this is fair on anybody, and the people on this panel, I know, and many others have worked very hard with officials at government level as well, to try and find the best way through the whole process, so that students watching in, I guess, aren't disadvantaged by the COVID situation. So we've got to take sort of fairness in the round here. This is we think, certainly we think at ASCL and many others think this is at least the least bad way of doing it. So when you're talking about fairness, it's got to be set against the backdrop of where we are and the best way to do it. I think, you know, if exams had happened normally, there will be students who would have been right on the edge of an A, you know, grade A, and got a B and might have been 1 mark off. And you could ask questions about whether that's fair as well. So, you know, the whole exam awarding situation is full of questions like that. But it is right. I mean, Richard's made the point that teachers are very good, actually, and you'll have noticed this going on probably in your lessons, or you'll have noticed it yourself when you can tell can tell when one student sort of performs better than others. So getting the students in the right order is something that'll go very well, and as Richard has said, that you know, that what that will mean is that there will be some students on the borderline, but they would be anyway, you know, or just unfortunately the wrong side of the borderline, but they would be anyway in a normal exam situation. Unfortunately, that's a sort of sad fact of how exams work, and in that sense, this is no different, really.
Thank you. Derek, would you like to add to that question at all?
Yeah, I think I just really agree. This situation is absolutely unprecedented for everybody, and I think what's really important, I think what really stuck with me is when the government said that they want everybody's certificates this year to have the same equivalence as certificates in last year and next year. And I know that for many people that have joined the call now, you might have brothers, sisters, cousins that sat exams last year or sitting them in the future, and you want to know that your certificates carry as much weight and worth as those when you're going on to university or college or looking for work. So it's that sense of equivalency and fairness that we're looking at as well, and that's why we need this ability to look and adjust grades to make sure that your grades this year carry that equivalence with both last year and future years as well.
And Joe, just one thing from me, if I may. I think it's really important here, and I think Duncan made the point that what we're seeking to do is make things as fair as they can be. And the situation isn't ideal. And, you know, if we think about what we're trying to do, we're trying to make some of the best judgments we can about what would have happened if the exams took place. But we can never be certain because the exams can't take place. And so at an individual level, I think it's really important to say that if people are disappointed with the results they get, if they feel that they're not a fair representation of what they could have got, or perhaps if you're a private candidate and you're not finding it possible to find a centre who knows enough about you to make a secure judgment this year, then there will be an opportunity to take exams again in the autumn, which gives the chance for anybody who, for whatever reason, is dissatisfied with the grades they get this summer to be able to take the exams in the autumn and to be able to demonstrate what they can do at that point.
We have a few questions on the autumn exam series and the results on that, so I think we'll come back to that. I just have one more question about the standardisation process. This is from Owen Williams 1. The prior achievement from centres will be used within this standardisation process. And then he goes on to ask that, has Ofqual not thought about the use of personal prior achievement in exams previously taken by those individual students, which could be particularly helpful in determining whether a student deserves to go up or down on their own merit rather than the achievement of students from previous cohorts? Kind of again linking back to the few questions I started this section with. But Richard, would you be able to answer a few of that for us?
Yeah, so we have looked at this issue, and I think what we know is that prior attainment, prior achievement of students is a really good predictor at a high level. So it's a good predictor at the national level. It's a good predictor for a group of students. But when you get down to an individual level, there's it doesn't work as well, and I think that will be familiar to people. Somebody who maybe struggled a bit at junior school might get to secondary school, everything might click into place, and they suddenly might make lots of progress. Somebody else who'd perhaps been a high flyer might drop back a bit, and that tends to even itself out across whole groups of students. So what we know is that prior attainment, so that might be how you did in your Key Stage 2 tests or how you did in that across all your GCSEs on average. We know that's a really good predictor when we're looking at groups of students, but we know it's just that bit less robust when we're looking at individuals. So we have looked at this carefully, but we've decided that looking at all the evidence, that the best we can do is to use the expected national results, prior attainment for groups of students, and the school and colleges result.
Does anyone have anything to add to that, Derek?
It's a quick plug, actually. I was looking at Ofqual's website today, and they've put out a really nice infographic which really clearly shows how that standardisation model will work. So I don't know if you shared it already, Joe, but if not, I think that's well worth people having a look at.
Make sure we post it at the bottom of this video after, actually. Yeah. Duncan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that for some qualifications, work that, if you like, is in the bank and has already sort of counted for students will be part of the process. So particularly for some vocational technical qualifications, if students are doing that, they've already got banked work, if you like. So that's real work done by the students. And that is part of the process. So it just depends what the qualification is, really.
I just wanted to, and we'll have to be very quick on this one, but we don't want to forget students that are going through this. We had a question about candidates that are in small cohort subjects, given a fair grade. So, for example, if only 1 or 2 candidates are in a centre are given a centre assessed grade for a subject, is the standardisation model the same? Is it likely to alter their grades up and down? How does this process work for students that are in small cohort subjects?
So I think the thing to emphasise here is that we're really driven by the evidence, and we're looking at how well the statistical model will work in different circumstances. The more data there is, the bigger the school and college that someone's in, the more confident we can be in the statistical arrangement. I think it's a very fair question that when you get down to small subjects, we will be very mindful of the, in the technical sense, the likely size of error or the uncertainty in the statistical predictions for small centres, and that will be a key factor in deciding how we use that statistical evidence. So, kind of put simply, that for many of the small centres, it may be that the weight that's placed on the amount of statistical evidence versus the grades submitted by the schools and colleges is just a bit different, and we put a bit more weight on the grades submitted by the by the school and college, because we know the statistical evidence won't.
Duncan, do you have anything to add on that question?
Well, I think this is why the exercise is both about the statistical moderation process on the one hand, but it's also about what teachers think about their students. And in situations like this with very small groups, or indeed where there are larger groups, and the statistics might say, well, you know, there's this many who we might expect to get a grade 7 and this many who we might expect to get a grade 6. We would hope that the role of the grades, the grades that teachers are, well, the grades that centres are producing, which may sort of be different, will be taken on board. And I think that's particularly important in the, you know, in the small subjects, you know, the small entry subjects here.
Thank you. I think what I would like to do is move on to, I know quite a lot of our audience today, and it's quite a difficult subject, the issue of private candidates. We have a question here asking how it's fair for schools to deny candidates who are deserving of a grade, who are then forced to potentially spend lots of money on external centres who, although they might be endorsed by exam boards, don't even seem to be properly regulated themselves. How is an external centre going to be able to have better judgment of an individual student than the school they've been at for 7 years? Can I go to you on this one first, Derek? I know it's quite a difficult question to field, but...
No, that's great. Thanks, Joe. So just to say, this is, as you said, it is difficult, and we've obviously had to balance some quite difficult situations. Both, again, thinking about equity across the various people that are need to have grades this year. So I think the first thing to say is that what we've done is we've made arrangements that where a head of centre knows the student and is able to assess and say that they understand the grade that they're awarding, have confidence in that they're able to do that for private candidates. But understandably, if a teacher or a school or college hasn't had any contact with the student, then they might not be able to submit that. So what we did do is put in place some arrangements where we gave some additional guidance in support of private students, where if they've got evidence of their learning throughout the course, they're able to actually work with a small number of providers to do some additional work in terms of validating that evidence to give those institutions the ability to submit a grade for them. I would just like to clarify, all centres are approved by exam boards, and we do monitor them. So we actually, for private candidates, we had to put in special arrangements where those centres did have to register with us, and we've actually carried out some additional checks with those centres before we've allowed them to do that process. So what we've really tried to do is balance the interests and try to give private candidates access to an alternative route to validate their learning and to have a grade submitted for them, while at the same time making sure that lots of other students are confident that there's not an easy way to get a centre assessed grade from an institution that might not have had as much contact as if they were getting their grade from a teacher. So yes, it's been difficult, but we've tried to achieve the best balance. If there's any students that haven't been able to get a grade this time, just to remind people that the autumn series that Ofqual have consulted on today, that will be available in the autumn, and we'd encourage people to make use of that, although obviously understand we'd like to give people a grade wherever it's possible to do so, based on the right evidence.
I just wanted to jump in at that point and say, obviously, for private candidates who are looking to go to university this year, the understandable question would be if those uni places would be waiting for them to take the autumn exams and how that would work. And obviously, that's not maybe placed for this panel.
Well, I would say we've also been in touch with UCAS, and we've heard from UCAS and universities. So just to reassure people to get in touch with the universities that you're intending to go to, because universities obviously understand the situation that everybody's in, and they have said that they would be willing to talk to students about their individual situations.
We'll also look to maybe answer some of those questions next week as well. We had a couple of admissions team members coming and talking on that as well. So just if anyone has questions about those uni specific, just to come back next week. The next question on private candidates is from Sid1. Regarding those students who are retaking, whether they're external candidates or candidates re-enrolled at their previous institutions, why are their previous grades being used to determine their exceptional hard work and efforts put in this year? Because surely the whole reason to retake was to do better and not have their previous attainment drag them down. Richard, could I ask you to answer that one for me, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. I think the important thing to emphasise here is that going right back to what we said at the start, what we're asking teachers to do in making judgments is to make a holistic judgment about the grade they think the student would have been most likely to achieve. And we've listed a whole range of factors they might want to consider. And clearly, when somebody's resitting, it's relevant to consider what grade they got before. But we're not saying they should base their judgment solely on that grade. What we're saying is they should consider that. Now, if, and in the sort of the point that Sid was making there, if actually the teacher has seen that they've made all these exceptional efforts, they've made great strides, then they'll be considering the starting point, but they might pick a finishing point that's quite a long way advanced from where they are. In another circumstance, a teacher might look at somebody and think that they've made little progress and that actually the same or a similar grade is the relevant one to submit. But the key point here is that we're asking teachers to make a professional judgment about what they would have expected the student to get. Yes, this is what they got before is a relevant piece of evidence, but absolutely we're not saying it's the determining piece of evidence. It's something they need to weigh in the balance and consider as part of making the judgment that they come to.
Does anyone have anything to add onto that before I move on to our last question about private candidates for this evening? Okay. Again, it's private candidates and standardization this time. This is from Gwill. How will private candidates be included in that standardization process? So they're a homeschooler who has never studied at a secondary school in the UK. So the record of the school, which happens to be my exam centre, is almost completely irrelevant to ability, educational history. So just wanted to kind of ask, in those circumstances, is that standardization process still fair? How does that work? And will any private candidate be a little disadvantaged by that?
So I think it will operate in a fair way. It will operate slightly differently, but only slightly differently. So I think what will happen is that so long as the exam board knows that a student is a private candidate, all schools and colleges have can identify their private candidates when they enter them, then the information about that student won't be included in the data that's used in standardising that centre. And what that means is, the reason that's important is because schools and colleges might have a different number of private candidates this year. They have a few more or a few less. Some of the schools and colleges that are taking on some of the private candidates that couldn't get results each year might have a few more. And as the questioner is sort of hinting at there, I think there's we want to reflect the normal, the typical entry of the college, and it not be affected by if there's a slightly different balance of private candidates. But so they'll be taken out for the data that drives the model, but they'll still get their grade based on the centre assessment grade and the rank order position that the school and college submits. And that's really important because, at the risk of repeating myself, I feel like I said this about 5 times, but because of the fact that we know that people haven't been standardised to make these central assessment grades, there will be some variation nationally in how this is done. It's important that anybody who gets a grade this summer is somebody who gets a grade both based on a central assessment grade given by the school or college, but also the position in the rank order, so that those central assessment grades can be calibrated and standardized to the right level. So they will still receive a grade in line with the rest of the students in the centre that has been through this process. And I think actually I would make the point that that is something that underpins fairness. So results for private candidates are going to be awarded on the same basis as for anyone else. And therefore that everyone can be confident that they've got an equal worth and an equal validity.
Thank you so much. We've had a live question just about private candidates. I'm just gonna, I don't know if anyone does know, but do we have any preliminary figures on, first off, how many private candidates there are in this season's GCSE and A-level, and how many of them are likely to receive a grade? Do we know how many students this issue does affect?
I can start, and Derek may have information as well. So
sorry for throwing that one out there. Yeah,
I think no. I think it's really difficult actually to be certain, because we know that in any normal year, it's not really an important factor in the data that exam boards collect whether or not a student's a private candidate, because in any normal year, whether or not a student takes the papers at a particular school or college doesn't matter. Those will get parcelled up and sent off to the exam board, and they'll be marked anonymously along with all of the others. And it's not really a relevant factor. The school and college will deal with the administration of all of that. And so that means that the data we hold on this is not completely complete. So the exam boards ask schools and colleges to identify, but in a normal year, that might not always be done consistently because it doesn't drive anything, it doesn't result in anything. So the estimate that we've got this year, looking at those kind of figures, is that across GCSE and AS and A level, it looks like there are probably at least 20,000 students, but the real number might be a little bit higher than that.
Yeah, and just to maybe to add some colour to what Richard was saying with some of the numbers, it's difficult to generalise about who private candidates are, because I think some private candidates are, well, what people traditionally think of as people that are homeschooled. But there are also private students who maybe sat their A-levels last year at a school and want to return to a school to resit. They might be counted as a private candidate. Maybe students that sat their GCSEs last year and return to resit, they're also private candidates. And then sometimes language speakers sometimes are not taught at the school that they've learned the language at. So often language speakers will need to go to school, and they're often considered private candidates. So there's a whole range of different types of person and different reasons for why people might want to enter at a school or college that they haven't actually studied with. So I tend to think of private candidates as being people that have studied independently of a school, and it covers a whole range of people, which is why it can be quite difficult to just put a finite number on it.
Thank you so much. I want to move on, and it's great timing today, as Derek already mentioned, that the autumn exam series consultation from Ofqual, I'm sure Richard will touch on this, was released today. We have a question from Satsun saying that they're a private candidate and they currently assume that they will have to be sitting the autumn exams. And although it might be difficult to give specific dates, and I'm sure, Richard, you can touch on that, they ask, are all the subjects going to be available? And if that is the case, is there any point if that's not to be the case, is there any point revising for the autumn exams until those subjects are confirmed and they know they can sit those exams?
Yeah, I think the question is absolutely right. It's important that we give clarity on what's going to be available in the autumn straight away. So, inevitably we've focused first of all on getting the arrangements in place for the summer, and we've confirmed all of those over the past few weeks. The final sort of confirmation, the final details was today. So our focus has immediately shifted to the autumn. And I think in the consultation that we've released today, which we would welcome people's responses to, we're proposing probably three things that I'll probably highlight. So firstly, we're proposing that all GCSE, AS and A levels will be required to be made available by the exam boards. So our job as the regulator, we are able to set rules about what the exam boards offer the qualifications must do and not do. So we're proposing in the consultation that we set a rule that every GCSE, AS and A level, including those that are available for resits in the summer, will be made available in the autumn, because otherwise a student who wasn't able to take the exam or thought they could have done better won't have opportunity. We're proposing that there'll be no minimum number, that if anyone wants to take it, that they'll be available. Though we are saying that if no one at all wants to take an exam or to find they've simply got no entries, clearly there'll be no requirement on them to offer it. Two other things that we're proposing in the consultation. So we're proposing that the exams in the autumn will be, in terms of the exams, will be as normal. So we're not proposing to reduce the number of papers or to change the papers. We think that would be too disruptive and potentially unfair. Students who didn't get the chance to take exams this summer will want to be able to demonstrate across the full range of the course. And if we were to, for example, take a particular period of time out of history, we might take out someone's strongest element. So we're not proposing that to require the examples to change the papers or to modify them, because again, students will have practiced and will have developed their sort of preparation on the past papers that are available. So we think the fairest thing to do is to require them was to make the normal papers available. However, given the uncertainty at the moment about exactly the basis on which schools and colleges are going to go back, and given the fact that the non-exam assessments that students have completed will be at all sorts of different stages of completion. Some students might have finished it, some students might have to do on it. We're proposing that the autumn series will be based entirely on students' performance in exams. We're not proposing to require students to have to complete their non-exam assessment. There's one exception to that in art and design, which is based entirely on non-exam assessment, where we are proposing that there would be a new task available for students. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we're proposing for the autumn. As you say, Joe, we're consulting on that. So that consultation runs for the next few weeks. So we'd really welcome, and again, if you can sort of popularise this will be immensely welcome. We welcome views from students on that and whether or not those proposals are right. And we'll reflect on what we're told before confirming this. But we are, to go right back to the question, we're really aware of the importance of getting clarity on the arrangements in place well ahead of the summer, so that students can plan. And so come results days, if people decide they want to resit, they know exactly what their options are.
Thank you so much. We had a live question earlier that touched on that. So just to get clarity for that specific user who's asking about the autumn exam season, specifically their GCSE drama or food tech and the practical elements within that.
Yeah.
Will the autumn exam only count the written examination? Yeah.
That's what we're proposing, but that's what we're seeking views on. So I think that, if people want to feed back to us, we set out in the consultation the reasons why that is and the difficulties we think there would be in trying to organise the non-exam assessments in such a short space of time in the autumn. But if people feel that that we've not made the right judgment, that there are different things that we could have considered, then we'd be very keen to hear from them. And I should say, I realise as I said it, I should correct myself. Of course, people who are taking the exams in the autumn won't be resitting. This will be the first time that they've had to sit the exam. So it is important that when we talk about it being an opportunity to take the exams in the autumn. It might be a resit for students who took them last year, but for most students, it'll be the first time that they have an opportunity to take the exams. And that's something we're very well aware of.
Thank you so much. Our next question from Mikos, if autumn exams are to be used, this is the big question, when are students likely to get their results? Can we come to you, Derek, first on this?
Yeah.
Would that be okay?
Thanks very much, Joe. So just to say that now that Ofqual have released its consultation with the proposals around A-levels taking place in October, GCSEs taking place in November, what we'll be doing as exam boards is working really carefully as part of the Joint Council for Qualifications, who publish a common timetable that all the exam boards use for scheduling exam boards. Normally we publish that quite a long way in advance as a provisional timetable, and lots of time for consultation on that, but obviously much less time for that in the coming few weeks. So we'll do as much as we can in talking to Duncan and colleagues that represent teachers and schools and colleges around what that schedule looks like before we publish it. But the aim is to try to get A-level results out before Christmas and GCSE results in the new year. And we will confirm those dates as soon as we're able to do that, because I know that people will want to know what those are.
Okay, thank you. And again, on results, now I'm sure we can't get a confirmed answer either way, but obviously for students, results day is quite a big celebratory day usually, or even if it's not celebratory, that students really need the support that schools can provide them, but also their peers, their families, things like that. CAF 1809 asks, will schools be allowed to open on results day for year 11 and year 13 students? I'm going to come to you, Duncan. I know there's been a lot of things in the news recently. There's a lot of spotlight on schools at the moment. It's a very hard question to answer, but I wondered if you could help.
It is. So it's impossible to say yes or no. I mean, we should remember that schools aren't closed, actually. They haven't ever closed. Schools are still open and are looking after and supporting the children of key workers and so on. So they aren't closed. Whether conditions will be relaxed by that point enough, sort of social distancing and so on, for there to be a traditional certificate holding, jumping up in the air in celebration sort of event, I don't know. I think it's probably unlikely. What I do know, though, is that schools will be desperately keen to do absolutely everything they can to support their students. They're very exercised by this on behalf of their students now, and they know that that people will be sort of disappointed not to have that occasion, as it were. But more importantly, they will be very keen to provide the support for those students whose grades coming through that process aren't what they expected, or perhaps what they need. And I know that they'll be doing everything they can to be available one way or another, be it sort of virtually or however it plays out, to support all the students when thinking about their place at college or place at university or whatever it is. So they'll be available one way or another, and they'll do everything they can to do that. But it remains to be seen whether schools will be sort of allowed to do anything more traditional that you might expect on that day.
Thank you so much. We're almost out of time. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I wanted to pick up a couple of live questions that you maybe haven't got round to. One here talks about disadvantaged students, and this might be one for you, Richard, and maybe you, Duncan, as well. Will disadvantaged students, such as those on free school meals, will they be disadvantaged in terms of the grades that they're predicted? I know in the first consultation, Richard, there was quite an extensive equality impact assessment. I don't know if, I've sprung it on you a little bit, if it's worth speaking about that briefly and seeing if this new process will be of more of a disadvantage to those students that find themselves in disadvantaged circumstances.
Yeah, so I think it's something that we're very alive to, and that we've been thinking very carefully about in terms of. So I think the first thing I would go back to is that what we're asking schools and colleges to do is to make a fair and objective judgment using all their professional expertise of the grade that they believe a student would have achieved had teaching and learning continued as normal. And so what for any student, we're asking for that judgment to be objective and not to reflect on particular characteristics that student may have, but to focus on what they would have done. And so that's really important. And one of the things that we've done since we published the first draft of our information for schools on how they should do this process, and the final draft, was to improve and to increase the amount of information that we put about thinking about how you might make these judgments objective, so that we could to help schools and colleges think about this, to kind of minimise the risk that any particular groups of students or individuals are disadvantaged by the process. So I think that's really important, making sure that judgments are as fair as possible in the first place. And we've also reminded schools and colleges about the way in which they might use some of the data they hold to help check the process at the end, to make sure that there's been no unintended consequences and nothing and there aren't things that appear to be problematic that have crept in, and we'll give them a chance to review that and make sure that they're still confident in their judgments. So that's really important about the upfront process. It's also something that we've thought of very carefully in the design statistical model, and we're continuing to think about. So one of the things that we're going to look at very carefully about the statistical model is about making sure that we don't just focus on how accurate that statistical model looks to be, but also making sure that in considering how accurate it can be, that it's accurate and it doesn't achieve that accuracy at the expense, for example, of particular groups of students. So we look for a model that is fair and accurate when we design a statistical model. So I think those are some of the key things that we're thinking about. It's absolutely at the forefront of what we're thinking about, because, of course, our aim for this year is that it's as fair as possible. And I think that being fair to all the different groups of students is clearly an integral part of that.
Can I just add one thing then? A couple of things, Joe. So just going back to a point that was made earlier about collecting work after the day, the day when schools closed, if you like, it really would have been unfair actually to say, well, we need to collect work from other students at that point, because disadvantaged students are far less able to deliver on that work, and I think that point was made earlier. So everybody involved in this process is acutely aware of this issue, and Richard's right. Schools are now looking at the grades that they're producing. They're using various tools that are available to them to make sure that the grades that their teachers are producing, their centres are producing, aren't any less advantageous to certain groups of pupils than you would otherwise expect. So everybody's very, very aware of that, and very exercised by it. But I think it's important also to say that what we're trying to do, or what everybody's trying to do here, we're trying to replicate what would have happened. Richard's made this point several times today. There are things that some of us are pretty unhappy about with our ordinary exam system, but what we certainly want to make sure is that nobody's disadvantaged by the whole process. So everybody's working very hard to make sure that that's absolutely right.
Thank you so much. I think that is a good time as any to round up today. Actually, we've got a couple minutes to spare. I think that's pretty good time management. Thank you guys so much for coming on today. I hope our users have found this really useful and informative. If there are a couple of questions that slip through the net, we will be on site, our volunteers will be on site to try and get you some answers to those. Just a quick reminder again that our next TSR Answers is next Thursday at 4 o'clock, and we've looked at the grading today, and what we'll do next week is look at how the COVID situation has impacted universities, university places, and how they're dealing with that process, and what, especially for any Year 13s listening now, that would be really useful if you're thinking about going into further education. So thank you guys so much. Yeah, and have a lovely long weekend. I think you all deserve it. Okay, see you later.